what do you think is the ideological investment in this idea of technology being a neutral thing?
I mean, in a way, when I think about the philosophy of mathematics, and even when I think about the genealogy of data, even prior to the 17th century, astrological data, so on and so forth, I think the answer actually precedes the question. I think that the function of regressing contingency, the function of reducing contingency for an idea of capital efficiency. And when we talk about capital efficiency, I think, when machine learning and AI first emerged, especially machine learning in the 1980s, it had a very haptic sense of negotiation with the world. It was about making, it was about doing, it wasn't so much about outcome. But as capital subsumed machine learning, it became a sort of objective for corporate interests, as you were saying earlier. And to see the type of arresting of creativity and the arresting and capturing of contingency for the aims of capital itself. And so machine learning, in the sense of, as I see it, and artificial intelligences and so on and so forth, are just a next iteration in the wider logics of enumeration that attempt to find a common language, a normalized language, which operates seamlessly with the functions of capital, with the function of governance, so on and so forth. So I think about someone like Leibniz, who derived the differential equation, and the differential equation underpins every machine learning algorithm and artificial intelligence algorithm that exists today. And to think about Leibniz's fundamental concern with actually having a governable mode of communication. So we can thank Leibniz for our national ID number, for all of those centralized sort of mechanisms of governance that put us down into a quantified being. And his proposals for this were, we're talking about 17th, 18th century. So right now, what we see is not necessarily the introduction of something new. What we see is a new sophistication of capital. I think is sort of what you're mentioning is like, capital should have been dead, and now it has reinvented itself actually as a mode of visibility. So it has to produce another mode of extraction in itself. So that's kind of what I'm saying is the sort of answer would precede the question. And in a way, we already saw this coming, because our idea of datafied culture, of preempting what our social relationships would be, those conditions already emerged prior to any sort of social delineation that we realize today.
I mean, excuse me, I'm very moved. When you look at the images you've just been showing, they're quite, and of course with AI you start to try and imagine yourself in the position of this observer, and it's a very strange observer. I mean, on the one hand there are these massive blind spots, it cannot actually see certain faces. On the other hand, it can see, at night, it's kind of a blazing vision at certain points. But all this vision is extremely purposeful. I mean, it's supposed to serve certain objectives and not others. It's not sort of some idle curiosity where it's just sort of hanging out and seeing what's out there. So I wonder if you can think yourself into this sort of array of technologies and describe what kind of world this sort of emerging apparatus sees when it looks out. What are its feelings, and what is it looking for? He's emailing his girlfriend, so I don't know what he's doing.
I was answering really quick.
Because don't misunderstand, because when I type, actually I type what you said.
Right.
So I'm thinking...
No, I believe you.
People always misunderstand me because I'm organizing my thinking. I mean, first of all, what is neutral? What does it mean by being neutral? Neutral means being indifferent. Indifferent. No? And this is not only a misunderstanding of machines and technologies, but this is fundamentally a misunderstanding of the world. Because when we say something, when we always define something, we always already have a certain ontological and epistemological presuppositions. every system, every models always already has certain presuppositions, and therefore it cannot be indifferent. Right? It is already different. So I would say that, as you said, that it is an ideology, and we have to overcome this. We have to understand that there's nothing as neutral, there's nothing as indifferent. Now the question that I have, and I have proposed since many years, is that if we understand that each system, as you have shown in your own work, if each model has a certain epistemological and ontological presuppositions, in what way can we change them? Now let me give you an example, a very concrete example, because this morning we start with a critique of Facebook. No? So what is there are many presuppositions in the system or in the platform of Facebook, but there was one very basic presupposition, is that every user is an individual. Every user is a social atom. And this is the beginning of realization of individualism of the 20th century. So if this is something that is presupposed in a system, in what way can we change it, and can we, by criticizing such presuppositions and introducing alternatives, can we think of other forms of use of technology, other forms of communities? So these are the key questions for me, instead of thinking of that, and also it's key strategies to think of technologies beyond, as you said, subsumption to capitals. So that's my response to your question.
And I think for me, I'm more interested in the space in between, that sort of borderland that Gloria Anzaldúa, talks about, and how we as sentient beings sort of self-modulate into different actualizations within different spaces, which we sort of do naturally anyway. We behave differently around our family than we do around our friends. So we are already sort of self-modulating. And so in that sense, for me, it's not so much about what the algorithm sees. I mean, power always sees. That's the function of power. It's a function of capitalism. And I think, for me, Fanon and Foucault spent a, extraordinary amount of time articulating how the terms of visibility are important for power to actually function and justify itself. So when I see the image of the migrants seeking passage into the U.S., it is power made visible. But what I'm thinking through, especially in terms of machine learning and artificial intelligence, is the potential for resistance within those spaces in between. And really what this brings me back to, I think that's why I was saying in the talk that this type of revolution, for me, ultimately comes down to a revolution of us with ourselves, and actually how we consider our own self-actualization in accord with these technologies. Currently, right now, the narrative is preoccupied by ones of, I think we mentioned earlier, ones of nihilism, the singularity, doom, what it means for all of our work to disappear. Yeah, you can take mine. I'll be the first case study for that one. What it means for all of these functions to emerge. But there's another element within machine learning and AI that has yet to be realized in terms of data politics. And that space right now is being occupied by generative neural networks. And really what their power is it's almost literally a representation here. It's taking 2 points. So in terms of an image, it would just take 2 pixels and it interprets what's missing based on other types of data. And we know this from a neural network. Beyond about 3 or 4 or 5 layers, the computational communication is not readable by humans. And we're talking about neural networks with hundreds and thousands of layers, hidden layers, till they get their output. So what that means is that there's a computational logic that cannot be comprehended by humans. And I see a great potential in that in terms of race, in terms of gender dynamics, in terms of homophobia, so on and so forth, because all we know as sentient beings is our own perception with bias. And now we have something that exists in our world that actually lives outside of the understanding of bias. We just can't recognize it yet because our own perception are only geared towards what we know as racism, nation states, so on and so forth. So I'm actually curious of what, the black body in particular, what happens when the black body stops existing within the visibility of power and starts existing within the in-between of power, which is where Fred Moten says it already exists.
But the attempt to remain innocent or to appear innocent to systems requires you to read those systems quite well. Absolutely. And to have a very clear sense of how they're reading you. Absolutely. So presumably, all of us will read the kind of eye looking at us much more.
Yeah. But I think we take for granted that function already exists, that we already, marginalized communities already have a method of operation and sometimes an algorithmic method of operation to circumvent visibility. So for instance, where I live in London, I live in the borough of Lewisham, and it's a stop and search site. And currently, police stop and search is handed over to a predictive policing system. And so that mode for stop and search is currently driven by both humans and algorithm. But what was interesting was not the stop and search, because it happens in London. What was interesting is as I passed the stop and search, there was a neighbor sitting on her stoop, a stranger, and she said, "Hey, young man, there are 4 cops over there. They're stopping every 3rd or 4th car. They're only stopping this age, this such and such." She already knew how to circumvent the visibility prior to me even arriving and actually influence my behavior within that negotiation. And if we go to communities that are traditionally marginalized, it's not that the drone sneaks up on them. They know it's coming. It's that the drone's massive targeting actually got maybe a 1 millisecond ahead to their own movements of resistance. And so I think when we think of those types of terms, it actually what emerges is an optimistic view that actually says there is a term of resistance, there is a term of being that lives outside of governance. Because as long as computation relies on mathematics, there's a temporal lag. It may be a few milliseconds, and in terms of computation, that's an eternity, but in terms of resistance, that's also a lifetime.
Hui, I wanted to ask you more about your students, because you said at one point that there was something about their generation had a particular kind of misery, you said, with regard to these things, and I wondered how these things break down generationally. And what the kind of intergenerational consolations one might give for that kind of misery? Because usually the stereotype is the opposite, that the young are more attuned to these kinds of things.
Right. Well, I didn't really focus on the question of generation. I was trying to say that from my generation, for example, that I graduated, I studied AI 15 years ago, and at the time, there was a very beginning of this wave of, there was just the end of the dot-com hype and so on, and the imagination of technology was very different from today, what we have or what we see in media. So for example, you every day in newspaper, what we see is that when or until what point which kind of job will be replaced by machines. Every day you see this in newspaper and so on. And there's speculations on are philosophers going to be replaced, are sociologists going to be replaced. So that is a really particular moment, I think. And when I ask my students this question, before I asked them, I didn't think that they have such a reaction. But when I saw that. After I have asked this question and after I have heard from them, I was a bit really astonished, like how their imagination or how the perception of the future is determined by certain discourse. And this discourse has to be questioned. So that's why I start with that.
On that particular issue of employment, there's a debate about this, right? That one idea is that extrapolating from history, when a certain category of job is rendered obsolete by technology, then new kinds of jobs necessarily crop up to miraculously employ the same number of people as who were made obsolete. But in this present situation, there is a real debate about whether the past is any guide to the future at all, because it seems that unless all of the Western middle classes were, for instance, to go into finance or technology, there wouldn't be that many other places for them to go except for, doing tattoos and massages and food preparation and all the kinds of labor that will be left over by all this. So what is the view of, as you as a teacher, teaching people who are, looking at immediate employment at some point, how do they feel about these kind of questions?
I think it's a very complicated because now, because this morning both of you talked about a lot about capitalism, about Marx, and I think the discussion is far beyond about unemployment and so on, because there was also speculation on if the current mode of technological development, meaning full automation, will be able to realize, for example, communism in certain sense. Why? Because with full automation, it is, well, the speculation goes that with full automation, it will lead to massive unemployment, and with massive unemployment it will lead to a redistribution of resources in the society. So maybe there is a possibility there. And it is true that if we look into the history, look at the history of technology, and especially with industrialization, there are new jobs being created when certain jobs are replaced. But it seems that this moment is also a moment of there's more and more uncertainty at our moment when we address these questions. So there's certain complications that I think maybe we can discuss.
I think, it's an interesting point about, the conversations and even the questions actually become bigger. These sort of questions that seem simplified, perhaps in early studies of Marx, now are quite nuanced. And in a way, I really appreciated your engagement with Capital, concerning the racialized body in relationship to colonization and slavery, and how, sort of in line with Alessandro Rengo, that idea of capital is already predicated on the slave body. But when I think in terms of unemployment and work, I think there's the same potential there, because there are certain nuances to unemployment that are scaled nuances. So any sort of subsumption of work from the individual won't happen on a universalized scale. It will happen on certain bodies of difference, and it will sort of scale up as we go, towards this very traditional type of hierarchy. But we also, there's another element of that. What we don't know are the contingent circumstances, the contingent possibilities of those engagements, and what that might mean for future social political aims. So when I think of industrialization, I think of a location such as Detroit, which actually the surrounding suburbs of Detroit has the highest Arab population in the United States. And the reason it has the highest Arab population in the United States is because Henry Ford refused at gunpoint to hire any African Americans. And so the only migrants they could get at the time, they sort of very traditional type of story, were from the global south. But what you see today is a very vibrant and a very active community that's very much embedded both in their culture and historicity, as well as this sort of new engagement. And so the mosque in that location means something different. It's sort of what you were saying. It means something quite different than perhaps a mosque here in Dubai, but at the same time, they're speaking a common language. And how do we reconcile that? So if AI is going to take work, and if it's going to take work from certain bodies at certain times, what are the scaled implications of that? Because they will be parasitic, right? So if we take away work from all black and brown bodies first, which Google has just done with Google Books, right? So most of the people scanning Google Books were actually of color. Those people have now been let go. They were not allowed to go in the fancy Google complexes, so on and so forth. They were segregated. Most of them worked at night away from visibility of Silicon Valley. And then now that Google is now, if I have this correctly, is not scanning books anymore, that population has, so AI has already taken those jobs. So in a way, this is a present concern. So now that AI has already taken those jobs, how then do we think about the next scale? Because that will have a parasitic.
So can you just explain how are those jobs lost?
Well, most of the scanners for Google Books, you know, they showed you a preview. I think it happens with Amazon as well. Most of the scanners were people of color from local areas in Oakland. And they already had restricted access to the main Google complex. So they were sort of ghettoized in a certain building. They couldn't do the free lunches or the Willy carts or bouncy castles. They had to go in straight labor overnight. But from what I understand, Google will no longer be scanning books for preview in this scale, which means that those minoritized bodies are already out of work, because whatever the next iteration is for scanning those books will be relinquished, as you said, to the machine. So in a way, when we talk about the future of work, the future for certain bodies is now, because they're already being let go. Yeah.
Getting back to this question of diversity, I mean, you raised in your talk China, Russia, and the US, and all of them having a sort of world domination stake in AI. I wonder how those three places would conceive of it differently. Is it possible to characterize it? What is that project for Putin or for?
So, well, first of all, I respond to what he has said. I think it's very important to think of the process of automatization and the replacement of certain work. But there is a really, my impression and my experience is that in certain thinking on this subject, there's a big mistake. A big mistake is based on the idea that the machines are equivalents of human beings. So, for example, a few years ago, you know, that when AlphaGo, you know, has beaten the triumph of the Go game in Korea, people were, well, I'm not Korean, but I heard from my Korean friends that they were really sad, you know, that you know, we lost the game. But this is really particular because, and sometimes also very ironic. Why? Because it tends to think that human beings are more superior than machines, but on the other hand, that they also make equivalence between machine and human beings. You see what I mean? So there is a kind of a paradox here. And I think that it is important when we're addressing the question of unemployment and so on, we have to understand, to interrogate the concept of equivalence. Now, I think that we can talk about what I call functional equivalence, but not equivalence. A functional equivalence means that machine is capable of replacing certain function. And we have to think our relation with machines by appropriating this function equivalence, but instead of being thinking that, well, we are going to be replaced, this is not going to be productive. And that is also leads to certain misery of people who don't think like this. Now, back to your question about because I was asked by Kenrick and Ben to address the question of the influence of ideology in development of technology and so on. But when they ask me, actually, I say it to myself that it's, in fact, we don't have enough ideology, you know, because it is determined by certain by certain concepts of technology, of a universal technology, of a universal history of humankind, which started since which was very dominant since the European Enlightenment. Let's remember that Kant has written a very powerful text on the universal history of humankind. So if we look at the development of technology in the USA, in China, in Russia, it is still very much based on this idea of universal history and universal technology. So what we see is that this technology, this geopolitics, will be determined by what Benjamin Bratton called a stack, you know? That different countries have their stack. But if you look at these different stack, so for example, users, cloud, and so on, they are actually not so different from each other. Well, they're different from each other in terms of interface, in terms of the language. But there's no such a diversity. You know? So they are actually competing towards what I showed as, you know, this imagination of singularity instead of thinking the question of diversity. So what we lack now is the thinking of a techno-diversity in the current geopolitics. So that is why I said that I want to take up the question of Henry Kissinger, who asked, what will be this new philosophy after the end of Enlightenment? Now, after the end of Enlightenment, for me, is a rejection of the universal history of mankind, the universal concept of technology, the concept of universal itself. Now, so how can we reopen such a question? It's also, I think that is what is lack in the current discourse of geopolitics based on technological development.
So are you saying basically that there is actually disappointingly little diversity in all these things? And if you are saying that, what are the kind of converging forces that seem to structure technology similarly in every place, since culture doesn't seem to be playing that big a part in it?
Well, yes, I think that culture didn't play an important part, and that is also related to your thesis concerning colonization as a main process of globalization. So when I try to say, you know, that the picture, the drawing that I have shown, I try to suggest that the modernization process is a universalization process of certain epistemologies. And of course, it requires modern science and technology, but there is nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that we should give up modern science and technology. This would be stupid. No, I'm trying to say that there has been a lack of reflection, and this lack of reflection is because we tend to situate, for example, technology and science on the same axis of time, determined by progress. You know? So that is why I think that still that the kind of the influence or the impact of culture on technological development is not yet significant in this process of modernization, because if you look at, let me give an example, modernization in China started, I can say, the second half of the 19th century. No, and before that, you know, there was no machines, there was no large-scale industrial machines in China. But if you look at what the situation today, that the Chinese government is saying that, well, our technology is surpassing the West and so on, and this happened in 150 years. It's really fast. And this speed is compensated by the sacrifice of a cultural reflection on the question of technology and science. And I think that maybe now is the moment to reopen this question.
I mean, I think in a sense it's, there tends to be this misconception of a causal link between technology and a social, cultural type of impact. Technology caused, the algorithm caused this particular effect, or this particular event caused this instantiation of the algorithm. And in a way, when that causal link is made, the tendency there is to relegate any immediacy of a particular type of body in their social political circumstance to be a sub-concern of a greater ontology of technology. So a body of difference here is a subset of our general idea of technology, or a body difference here is a subset to a temporality of a more universal type of culture. But I think even positioning the argument there is a return to the Enlightenment, because you cannot consider the universal without relying on those particular categories and the hierarchies between those categories. So in a way, I prefer to think about these modes, these social political modes, in the way that Fanon and Sylvia Wynter had already thought about it. When they're talking about, Fanon was talking about the relationship between colonization and technology, at the same time that Foucault, he's lecturing in Tunis when Foucault was attending those lectures, talking about the instantiations of biopower. So when I think about culture, if we think about it in a biopolitical sense, what Sylvia Wynter calls the bioepistemic, you cannot distinguish culture from technology. Now, how that becomes articulated against certain bodies is what the difference is here, right? And so in this way, it sort of goes back to your intervention about capitalism already being predicated, on the disadvantages of certain bodies. We can think of AI and machine learning as already being predicated on the exclusion of certain bodies. So to have a debate now about including those bodies is in a way nonsense. They weren't designed to include those bodies. The fundamental mathematics behind their operation do not allow for the inclusion of those certain bodies. So if we are going to include those bodies, one, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to, in a very Spivak type of sense, are we going to give those bodies a voice of whether they want to be included or not? And secondly, thinking about the process of inclusion is not just altering the fundamental makeup of algorithmic visibility, but actually altering what an algorithm is itself. And maybe that's where I see the potential in a generative neural network, because it's creating its own types of logics.
Well, that was my next question to you, was where do designers, for instance, go with this? I mean, once we've made these observations about how things are actually operating, and we have some level of understanding about what is the pattern of exclusion, etc. Where is the intervention required? Though, if you say that there's no difference between culture and technology, right, it comes back ultimately to culture. You have to
well, of
intervene.
Course, it comes back to relation and perception, right? So I think that's why I like, Sylvia Wynter's idea of that space already being a poetics. Glissant talked about that as well. It's already a productive and generative space. And I think that's what you're alluding to in the beginnings of AI and machine learning, is because it was a space that was just generating for the sake of making, and thus producing new ideas and new contingencies. If you actually look at Marvin Minsky, the sort of father of AI, the last interview he had before he died a few years ago is a scathing review of contemporary artificial intelligences, because what he was saying is, back in my day, and again, this is not a glorification of the past, right? But he's looking at a different haptic sense. He's saying, back in my day, we sat in a room and we just played. And every 3 days, we would come up with a new innovation and say, oh, that's cool, and move on to another innovation. And he's saying what's happened now is that each innovation itself is already tied to some corporate objective. So something isn't cool or viable unless it serves capital, as opposed to what Marvin was saying is the actual algorithmic process served the individual and the collective just as something that we would call progress. So, so perhaps the role of the designer or the artist is to actually stay authentic to the role of the designer or the artist, which is pure production, not in the sense of capital, but in the sense of being. Because it's always the concern, especially with the artist or designer, what their position and relationship is to the world that they're engaging with, and then what spits out is a beautiful table.
Do you have examples?
Well, I mean, I think that there are several artists that are working in this field. I like Ben's example, especially of the, what was it, Bob? Yeah. Something like Bob, which actually it's based on the fundamental tension between our relationship with AI and its history with cognitive mapping. But then at the same sense, it's actually trying to think about a new framework and where we might actually land as techno-social beings. And this sort of example of Bob is not the only one. This sort of articulation, again, of how we think about weather, how we think about music, an example of Rio's facial recognition, how we think about aspirations. I mean, imagine the potential if you go through the airport and your profile picture doesn't show up, but your aspirational animal. Like, how would Border Patrol deal with that when a lion comes to the border? And how do they capture their own measures of security when that's the contingency? So those are the sort of examples I would use.
Can I add one point to that? Because I'm always intrigued by the question of inclusion, because inclusion always presupposes exclusion. They're like pairs, and is it possible? Well, I don't believe. Is it possible to think of a universal scheme which is only inclusive at all? Now, you know that this was the dream of the Enlightenment, of having a universal system which was expressed in the Constitution, which was expressed, for example, in Leibniz' Characteristica Universalis, in Leibniz's later writing, like, for example, monadology. No? And we know today that this is not possible. A complete inclusive system. So we have to face this difficulty. And in order to face this difficulty, we have to come back to the question of difference. Myself, I always tend to, I wanted to start with the question of difference, and to think how far can we go with the question of difference without becoming fascist. Like because I have a difficulty of talking about what is culture, because whenever you talk about culture and cultural difference, you easily fall back into kind of cultural essentialism or ethnocentrism, and then you end up being a fascist or a proto-fascist. But is it possible to rethink of the question of difference? And maybe we can say exclusive inclusion in the sense. And I think that this is an important subject for design, no? Not simply to think that we include everything, because this is not possible.
I mean, I think, in a sense, this is why I do a lot of research with Fanon and technology. Because if we really read past his proposals on violence, which is a different sense, has to do with the pathological, what Fanon was actually proposing is that any relationship between a body of difference and a body of dominance, it's equally alienating for both bodies. So it's no point in having a polarity between the two. What real inclusivity would require is a complete disruption of both systems into a new type of what he called a new radical humanism. It's something that we can't imagine because it takes basically the reprogramming of every single body. Now, unfortunately, Fanon died at 36, so he didn't live long enough to actually realize that. I'd be curious on what his thoughts would be, you know, with machine learning, which is what I'm working on right now. But you know, this idea, you know, that problematic of, you know, is inclusion enough? And then when do we fall just into representation, you know? And we look back at Joy's project, you know, that's the danger, you know, of that project is by including a black face into facial recognition, you're also including dominance and power to recognize that face, you know. But in another sense, the exclusion of her face enacted her on a different research path that would not have happened without the encounter to exclusion. So that's what I was saying, that simultaneous space, which can be equally productive. So, you know, and how do we articulate that? I think that we have to articulate that in something, you know, perhaps some type of speculative mode of being that has to accept the fact that this contingency or this thing that I don't recognize could be the pathway to my future. And I think that those are my feelings, to start talking a lot, those are my feelings that are back to work. I think the debate is more complicated than just I'm working, not working, or the subsumption of certain techniques, because those techniques are already owned by capital, so take them. What I want is a different type of technique that capital hasn't caught up with yet. So if they want to take my old desk, they can have it. A robot can sit there all they want and perform those mundane routines because capital already owns it. What I want is another speculative mode. And of course, capital will catch up. But perhaps there's a sort of breath of fresh air to where we can articulate a new form of sociality.
I'm going to open it up to the audience in a minute, so prepare your questions. But I just wanted to return to a theme in your presentation, which is, and in fact it relates to this question on the wall here, which has to do with the artificial in artificial intelligence. Because, and I know very little of Chinese metaphysics, but my observations from a distance, which apply somewhat to India too, have to do with, well, I feel that this category of the artificial is less powerful across a lot of Asia than it is in European society. That the idea of sort of the fear that Europe has of the inauthentic, that we can build machines and we can build tools and everything like that, but at some point, they might take us over to a terrifying extent, and we might be alienated from our natural humanity. That is not a fear that Asia has to the same extent. I think that Asia's much more comfortable with all manner of kind of prosthesis to a level that often surprises Westerners. That, you know, how is it possible that people could be just so joined to technology and live in a completely technological universe, which I think was often the sort of strange alienation from Japan back in the 70s and 80s, when they saw what Japan made of cinema, of television, of gaming, etc. So at least in the reception of technology, even if not in the development of technology, I think you see very, very different uses around the world, that cultures of use of phones and kind of technological systems of all sorts do vary massively.
I think this is an extremely complicated question, and that may exhaust us a whole week to discuss it. But to put it simply, because as I tried to show, or as I said before, that, for example, the modernization process in China is only, we can say, 150 years, and it's a bit longer in Japan and so on. No? So imagine in 150 years you have to catch up something that you didn't have, but Europe have developed since a long time. And so the experience was completely different. The historical experience was very different. Now let me go back a little bit earlier to what I called European modernity. Now, European modernity, if we say, where some people says, starting from the 16th century, someone says 17th, but let's say 17th century on, we see in Europe is the developer of a mechanistic philosophy, the philosophy of mechanism, which was a dominant discourse you can find in Descartes, you can find in Newton, in Kepler, in Galileo, and so on. They become the dominant episteme, which Foucault analyzed already. And this dominant episteme, this philosophy of mechanism, of course, was later challenged. Was very, very challenged because it ceased to be an alienation of humanity, of what is a human. So, for example, towards the end of the 18th century, you see that there is a return, or there is a revolt against mechanism with the concept of organism. So, for example, in Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment, you see that organism was a critique of mechanism, and then you see from the post-Kantians and go on until Whitehead. So there was a movement against that, of seeing the problematic of organism, and this was a process of the European modernity. But in the contrary, if you look at Asia, there was no such experience. There was no such experience. When Joseph Needham, when he comments in the second book of Science and Civilization in China, he says that, well, the Chinese technological thought and scientific thought is organic. So there was no such a passage from the mechanic to the organic. I'm not saying that I completely agree with what he says, but that is what he says, and we still have to think or to reflect on what he has said. But these are two different historical and cultural experience of technology. So I think that may respond to your question. And there was also another question, is the political question, that in what way can you catch up with the West? For example, in China in the early 20th century, there was a slogan is to catch up with the US and the UK. So we just have to speed up. So that's why people said that the true accelerationist is actually Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong.
Audience, do you have any questions for our speakers? Yes. I think wait for the mic.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting discussions today, and obviously we're discussing belief in AI, but there's a new sphere, as has been discussed today, but there's multiple belief systems, and over the history of time, differences in belief systems have created conflict. With silo belief systems, we can manage that. But in this new sphere, how do we allow belief system design to come into AI, as a suitcase phrase, and take that forward? And who monitors and manages when there are conflicts in those belief systems?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's what I was trying to pick up on in my presentation. It just wasn't enough time, is that nuance. And I think what's particularly fascinating as well as horrifying about algorithms is that multiple belief systems can exist in the same space, the same container, and you just extract whichever belief or portion of belief. So even belief itself can be fragmented, and you can put together different beliefs into your own belief, right? And we see that replicated in social media, so the echo chamber is a bit more nuanced and complicated, because I can have a different belief system on animals, but I can also kind of fragment that and port that into politics, and also port that into something else. So it becomes very parasitic, and how do you deal with this mess? And I think that's the fundamental point of power. And that's, sorry, I haven't answered. And I think that this is the point of intervention. And I think that's why I want to collapse the temporality from thinking about the future, because the moment is now, because it's happening right now, and there's no social political framework in terms of policy, governance, or so on and so forth that has been able to figure it out. And we as citizens are sitting around watching them figure it out. And when we think in terms of our engagement with governance, when have we ever had an opportunity to act while they're confused? and this is our time, but we are obsessed with the idea of preemption and future, that we're actually going to miss this moment. So we won't figure out work until after the AI has taken work. So that's kind of where we are. And sorry, it's not really an answer. It's more like the provocation.
I want to give Hui a chance to respond also, since you were using his term of the noosphere, but I don't think he really understood the question. So could we just have a brief repetition of what it was you were asking about that?
Sure. With disparate belief systems globally and AI we're taking it globally in the noosphere concept, then how do we counter, or how do we predispose the fact that there are different belief systems that today create conflict in the non-AI world? How do we manage, monitor, and govern those conflicts in belief system from an autonomous perspective?
Well, in the discourse of the noosphere, and what we have seen in the past decade, it is a realization of what I call the technological systems. So we are not dealing with one AI, we are not dealing with one machine, we are dealing with systems. And this is more and more the case. And with this imagination of the realization of what is called the superintelligence, is also the realization of a gigantic technological system in which all governments, in which all administration could be done through, where we say, a universal system, completely inclusive maybe. So it is that the problem which bring up the problem of the question of freedom, the question of determination, which that was raised at this morning. And so how can we think of a future that is beyond such a noospheric reflection? For me, it is the question of thinking the diversity of systems, thinking of the heterogeneity of systems, and that is why I propose. That's why I propose that we have to rethink the question of technology from the perspective of multiple cosmotechnics, and from this moment on, we have to think of maybe we can say the diversification of systems and the diversification of beliefs. But we can do this through AI. We can do this through another different understandings of AI, through intervention into the models of AI, mathematical models, and so on. I believe that these are all possible, but we have to think. We have to start now.
But aren't things moving the opposite direction? Isn't it becoming more and more difficult to sustain any alternative to the main platforms? Like I was saying, in the industrial era, there were far more car companies than there are search engines today. It just feels like the center is taking everything in the current system.
Well, I mean, the complication is in that if we tend to believe in the totalization of capital, then we already block our way. We have no way out. No? So when he says something before, he says that you want another type of technology. No, you don't want the technology of capitalists. For me, I think that there's no capitalist technology per se. There is only capitalist applications of technology. Now, if you look at Facebook, for example, Facebook, the TCP/IP programming language, which one of them belong to capitalism? No, it's only Facebook it belong to Mark Zuckerberg. So there are technologies available there, and these are technologies we can appropriate to build different things. And we have to build things that break away from this, what I call capitalist epistemologies. And I think that these are all possible. But of course, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult because, in the academic environment, you have to think of funding applications, the sustainability of fundings, and so on. But it is possible, but we have to try.
Can we get the mic down here at the front? Another question.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. I'm Eun-Soo Kwon. I'm the director of Industrial Design Program at University of Houston. So we learned so many new keywords and so many great ideas and so many great proposals, but we are looking at the present and the future. Those are the students. So if we bring all those knowledge and knowing and intelligence, what we discussed in the context of design education and universal education, because we are talking about global grade show, right, next to the building. So my question as an educator, if we are looking at any interventive, new platform, and new exclusively inclusive design model, which can serve or propose the way we teach and the way we educate the younger generation, those are the creative talent. Can you share any example, any model we can think about how designers to develop the future education? Any universal education model will be important because we used to have the academia was the leaders to bring all those knowledge and learning. But after modernization, industry took over the leadership. And right now, AI took over the leadership. So academia seems to be far behind because we are dealing with the daily life of our students. So how we can connect those things to provide and bring back our leadership in our design education or general educations?
I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that is sort of reoccurring, and I think it's how do we deal with this immediacy, especially when we have, students that are before us dealing with very immediate situations in their lives outside of education, and for me, that's it's a pedagogical methodology, and I think that because of the sophistication of these types of tools, it's going to require a different sophistication of how we engage with systems of knowledge. So in a way, we are behind because when we think of AI, they're already thinking about correlative relationships. They've thought about that for decades, right? And us as academics, we are stuck in one container. So and what that requires then is a decentering of what we think we know to open up possibilities for other engagements that we don't know. Like for instance, in the design program, would you teach Sylvia Winter, because she talks a lot about the episteme and technology and design of culture. Would you bring in Fanon, who talks about early radio and the design of radio in terms of colonization in Algeria? So those types of, someone like Simone Brown or Hortense Spiller, which is talking about the design of the slave ship and what it means for logistics and passage and the design of infrastructure. And so, but what that requires is a thinking, and it requires us not to return to the perception of representation, that body of difference is only concerned with that topic. We need to be sort of this Guattarian idea thief and say that actually this idea can be applied here. And by applying it here, perhaps we can break the normalized mode of engagement and maybe get to the point where we can preempt our students' concerns.
Thank you very much for the question. I don't know if I understand very well because of the acoustic is really resonating. But I think that first of all, we have to think about our education system. Because since a few years, I was very often asked by journalists to write about the crisis of the humanities. And what does it really mean, that the crisis of the humanities? Because technology is moving so fast, so any reflection on the, from the side of humanities is rendered obsolete and really important. But of course, this is very much based on the division of labor inside the education system. You have humanities, you have technologies, and sometimes they're considered to be opposite to each other. So there is, on the one hand, you have the rationality of technology and you have the hermeneutics of humanities. But the problem is that this opposition is not valid today. It was valid in the time of Adorno, it was valid in the time of the Frankfurt School, but not valid today. And we have to think this in a different way. To think about reform of the education system, which we need a new program for designers, for engineers, also for philosophers. And there's one very remarkable example, if we talk about the history of AI, was the intervention of the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus in the 1960s and 70s. So Hubert Dreyfus was the person who brought Heidegger to Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, to the community of AI scientists. He was commissioned to write a report about the development of artificial intelligence at the MIT, and he criticized by saying that what these people are doing can never realize real intelligence, because this is too much Cartesian. No? And you have to understand a different way of intelligence, for example, that was described in the first division of Heidegger's Being and Time. So what happened is that many scientists went to read Heidegger. For example, Terry Winograd, who is a very prominent AI scientist, and he admitted publicly that he was very much influenced by going to philosophy, to Heidegger's Being in Time. So this is just an example to say that how problematic our education have been in kind of separating because of the divisions of labor. So I think it is the moment to think the melting down of the education system, and by taking this meltdown situation, we can think of new institutions.
And can I promise I'll be quick, I promise. I think in addition to that, I agree, this sort of disruption of the education institution, but I think immediately what's possible is the reordering of our own perceptions of importance, because we tend to think, in most syllabuses and most pedagogies, we tend to think of a concept, and then we think of the body of difference or other political engagement, resistance, so on and forth, as a reaction to that. And what we're doing in that sense is reinforcing the dominance and normality of that concept. And so I imagine an education that reversed it. So even, our engagements today is sort of a replication of that, because these issues sort of get segregated into ghettos. That says, okay, here's artificial intelligence, here's a bias reaction to artificial intelligence. And we can see sort of the enactment in the great posters. So I think, thinking through a way of pedagogy is thinking through what does truth and capability become first, and then thinking about AI. And I think that derives different questions and answers than assuming AI is this sort of mythical being that we must respond to in our own sense of truth and capability, because I think in action it's the other way around. So.
Lunch calls. That's it. Will you join me in thanking our wonderful presenters this morning?